Well, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this special Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health Centennial Lecture. I'm Karen Bandine Roach. I'm the chair of the Department of Biostatistics, and it's our great pleasure to host this event. As you know, we've been having a lot of fun looking back in our history as part of the Centennial, but one of the most important aspects of the Centennial is really to look forward. And then data science is emerging as an enormously important facet of the future of biostatistics and of all of public health. In that spirit, I'm tremendously pleased to welcome Dr. Philip Bourne, who's the Associate Director of Data Science at the National Institutes of Health. By way of a very brief introduction, Dr. Bourne came to the NIH from the University of California at San Diego, where he was the Associate Vice Chancellor for Innovation and Industry Alliances of the Office of Research Affairs, and also professor in the Department of Pharmacology in the SCAD's School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences. He was trained as a physical chemist. He obtained his PhD from the Flinders University in South Australia, and his professional interests focus on the derivation of relevant health outcomes using algorithms, data mining, text mining, machine learning, meta-languages, biological databases, health outcomes using algorithms, and visualization. He's published over 300 scientific articles and 5 books, and these address problems as diverse as systems pharmacology, evolution, cell signaling, apoptosis, and immunology, just to name a few. He also is extremely committed to furthering the free dissemination of science through new models of publishing and better integration and subsequent dissemination of data and results. As the Director of Data Science at NIH, Dr. Bourne leads the Big Data to Knowledge, or BD2K initiative. The NIH Director, Francis Collins, has characterized this program as, quote, an NIH-wide priority initiative to take better advantage of the exponential growth of biomedical research data sets, close quote. I encourage you to visit the BD2K website to see how very impressive a program BD2K has become, sponsoring research centers of excellence, training initiatives, consortia to promote the improved sharing of biomedical data, as well as targeted software development. Dr. Bourne, we look forward to hearing the thoughts you've prepared for us today. Let's go ahead and welcome Dr. Bourne to Johns Hopkins.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me sort of jump straight into this. First of all, I should say you can't be an open science advocate without actually posting all your slides in somewhere. So these slides are on SlideShare, should you wish to have them at a later date. In fact, as I was saying earlier on, there are quite a lot of presentations quite like this. So now we used to say in research I would never say the same things twice. Now I just say one thing over and over again. So this is it, more or less, with a few new bits and pieces. So I think it's always important when what I'm going to tell you comes with a certain bias. And that bias, of course, is my own background, which you've sort of heard about already, so I won't actually go into that, but there is a certain bias there. I think it's important to sort of set the stage for where we've come from and where we're going. At least from the perspective that I'm trying to bring to the NIH, and I think that's shared at some level at the NIH. And, you know, in a sense, talking about data science and big data is really just, in some ways, the same words for things that have already happened that were described by different words, such as the emergence of bioinformatics, the emergence of computational biology, the emergence of systems biology. So I think it's really worth looking back at that history to get a sense of where we're going. And I have to say that what I'm going to say here is, perhaps towards the end, a little controversial. But what was interesting is I actually used the same slide to talk to the advisory group to the NIH director, which is sort of the leading oversight body at the NIH, and no one disagreed with what I had to say. So we'll see whether you disagree. So it's the basic idea. We started as a discipline. And the time I started doing this, we were really weird. We were these weird outliers of folks who took small amounts of data, sequence data, DNA sequences, protein sequences, and tried to do various things with them with a computer. Or were trying to model proteins and doing all sorts of things. And that really, I think everything at that point was kind of and then we got to a point where things became more experimentally driven in what we did as computational folks. And I think a leading point of that was the emergence of the Human Genome Project. I think that helped create, it's certainly what brought me to be standing here today, and I think it in fact influenced a lot of what happened subsequently. And it's the basic idea that what they said when they started that project is this so they created a series of centers to do the genetic and physical mapping. And I was involved at Columbia University with a center looking at chromosome 13. But what was the NIH directive was that this is not going forward without proper data, first of all, data sharing, which came from the Bermuda Accord, but also that there has to be people, not only who maintain the data, but are an integral part of the activity. And I think that was what began a sea change. And so people, as bioinformaticians, started to emerge. And then what happened is people got really excited about the promise of the human genome, which I also worry about, by the way, for big data, because it turned out to be quite oversold. So half of the people at that time, including myself, who were calling themselves bioinformaticians, moved over to the private sector, which had suddenly got enamored by all of this and what it could mean for healthcare and drug discovery and so forth. And then about working on the time frames the industry work on, 4 years, not a great deal had happened. All these people were back on the street, or many of them, and essentially we went through this phase where we emerged, we were oversold, and then we became, I think, to some extent, a service. So traditional labs, if you like, looked upon the guy or gal who did computing as kind of a service provider to that organization, to that lab or bigger organization. And I think only today, perhaps for the last few years, because now you can become a tenured professor, doing computational biology or systems biology, we became a real partner in the enterprise. And that's history. Going forward, and I don't know how long it's going to take, but my sense is that within the next few years, people who are cross-trained, who actually do analytical work, as well as generate their own data perhaps, but not necessarily, they are going to be the major drivers of discovery in biomedical research and healthcare. And that remains to be seen, but that's at least my prediction. So I think it's also worth looking at it from the point of view of the raw material we had to deal with. So I think starting off, there was a limited amount of data. In fact, people who were really at the forefront of this, colleagues like well-known evolutionary biologists I used to work with at UCSD, Russ Doolittle, I mean, they used to first do the experiments to generate, the sequences one amino acid or one base at a time, and then do some computer analysis of it. It's just completely, now the data, of course, endless streams of next generation sequencing data. And then I think that we had limited, and then as we got more data, we started doing things to actually describe that data and represent that data in better ways, which of course is important. So, so ontologists came into some degree of fashion. And my standard joke is I could stand in front of an audience like this and talk about, if I did this 10 years ago and I talked about ontologies, I would put you to sleep in like 1 minute. Now it takes 10 minutes before you fall asleep. So, I think there's an awareness that the structure of data and so forth is very important to the research enterprise. Even if people are not necessarily doing it, they see it as important. And then I think another aspect of pretty much where we are today, and I have to say, in many ways, the NIH has created, or is one of the agencies that's helped create this situation, that we're in this position where the data is very siloed. So we funded a project, it created a data resource, that data resource exists and it's used, and that was fine when the majority of the research we did was on one or two or a small number of data types. Now what happens, in a translational sense, we're all over the place, we're using data from everywhere. And it's become, I think, in my personal view, a real problem because it slows us down. Because even as much as I'm against much of the way journals operate, the fact is that they do have a common interface. There's an abstract, there's an introduction, there's some results, there's conclusions, there's references. And you know what you're getting. So you go to a biological resource, a data resource, every one of those is strived to be completely different to everyone else. So you essentially have to learn how to use each one individually, and they have different ways of different API methodologies. It's a problem. So I think the idea of moving towards a more open integrated system is something that is really important, and I think we're certainly pushing towards that at the NIH, and I'm going to show you a little about what that means in a bit. And then of course I think how we're perceived and described has changed over time, and I kind of covered that. But I think there's still, a disparity now between, because of what is of value to scholarship is changing. So, the people who do a lot to generate the data, do a lot of the analytics, they're often within the system, the academic system, what you would call research professors or research scientists, which frankly don't have the same street cred as being a tenured faculty member or tenure track faculty member, and yet they have increasing importance to the system as what we value as scholarship changes. So I think there's an interesting dynamic going on there, and I'm not going to say any more about that, but it's something that it's one of my hot buttons, and I'd be happy to talk about it if there's any interest. But I think all this points to what we're anticipating or potentially anticipating at the NIH, which is this notion that this is the beginning of a disruptive, potentially the beginning of a disruptive phase. And I'm going to give you an example of what's happened where there has been disruption, and I think you know it. It's just one example of where things have changed quite dramatically, and you know and understand it. But I'm going to sort of present it in a slightly different way, and then I'm going to ask you the question of whether, in fact, this is what you perceive going to happen in biomedical research and healthcare. So, what do I mean by all of that? So, first of all, I think we've got to say that something is fundamentally changing, and big data has got all this attention. But I think what's important is it speaks more than just about the data. It speaks to new methodologies, new skills, new emphasis, and probably the most fundamental change of all is new cultures and new modes of discovery. So if you accept all that, or at least let's start looking and saying, what is actually happening? So I just like these two books in different ways that illustrate the same kind of thing. And one of them, the one on the left, relates to the notion that we're now in a new revolution, that this is the information revolution, nothing new there. But I think what's new in the thesis of this book is the idea that this is actually happening much faster than we anticipated. Google Car is a good example of that. The fact is that it processes 750 megabytes of data per second from sensors in real time to create an environment which is arguably much safer than a human trying to do the same thing. And the fact is, no one really doubted that this was coming, but the fact that it came as quickly as it did, you can argue this has to do with Moore's law, you could argue it has to do with algorithmic developments, all sorts of things. But the fact is, it's one example of things happening more quickly than we anticipated. The other one, which I'm going to emphasize, is this notion of what happens when something goes digital. And so let me illustrate that, and it's this so-called 6 Ds of development. So, and I'll use photography as an example, and then let's relate that to something that's closer to our, perhaps closer to our hearts. So what was clear is Kodak invented the digital camera, and then they shelved it because they saw it as interfering with their film business. And they didn't actually do much about it, even as the field of digitized images, either through the cameras or whatever the technologies, that was starting to grow. So the digital content was starting to grow at an exponential rate. They didn't see it coming because it was very low on the exponential curve, and as such, change was still fairly happening relatively slowly. And then what happened is we went into this, so that's the deceptive phase. Then we went into this disruptive phase, where at the inflection point, suddenly, you know, Rochester doesn't look like so desirable place to live anymore. Things for Kodak have really gone downhill because the market effectively has collapsed. And they were not positioned in the business to actually take advantage of it. And then for me, being you know, a Bernie Sanders fan, a bunch of other things happened. That, you know, there was demonetization, dematerialization, and democratization, these further Ds. Right? And what we ended up with was something, a business model that was absolutely and utterly different than what we had before, and it was exciting in a whole different way. So instead of the production of the image being the business model, it was really about communication using images that became potentially the business model. So while Kodak is essentially, I'm sure, is worth nothing, effectively, Instagram is valued at whatever it is, $40-odd billion. So this was, you know, this was a complete change. So what on earth has that got to do with biomedical research? Well, perhaps nothing, but on the other hand, perhaps quite a lot. In the sense that for a lot of the research that we do, there's been a fair degree of digitization for quite some time. But the real sort of, I think, change is coming from the fact that the electronic health record, through, you know, federal mandate, has in fact become more and more prominent in what many of us do, and will continue to do so. And so you could argue that, in fact, we're starting to see this same exponential growth in digitized content that it's going to impact biomedical research and healthcare. Now, the question is, are we in this deceptive phase? Will we reach this disruptive phase and then see this completely different models emerge where, you know, one outcome from this could, of course, be what we're pushing towards in personalized medicine in any case, which is the idea that the patient is really at the center of the healthcare enterprise, as opposed to, I would argue, not the case right now. So, you know, but there are differences here. First of all, digital photography is a free market economy. Biomedical research and healthcare is really not a free market economy. The fact is, you work really hard to get your next grant, but you're not really being measured, frankly, in my opinion, by the product of your previous efforts. But anyway, we could get, that's a whole other controversy, but we could get into. But the point is, it may not be the same, it may not be a fair comparison, and maybe it is. And, you know, I just leave that as an open question for you all. But there are other aspects of what's going on which we consider, which are really important to this, the consideration that are we in this sort of disruptive phase? Are things about to change and more than we anticipate? And so the other drivers for this are things like sustainability. Now, I could show these two graphs to a first or second grader, and they would tell you the obvious, which I could tell you, is you can see for yourself. On the left-hand side, we have the growth in the NIH budget. Actually, it's got a little better because we've got a $2 billion bump this year for FY17. But on the right-hand side is the growth just in the nucleic acid research, which actually keeps track of biological databases that come online, in the number of databases. So we've got a flat budget, and we've got data increasing at a very fast rate. It's clear without some kind of change, this doesn't scale. Either we take more money from fundamental research to support data we've already got, or we find more efficient ways of managing the data we've already got, or we come up with some other scheme. And we have thoughts about this, needless to say. It worries some of the institute directors. And John Lorsch, in the middle there, who's the director of the NIGMS, NIH, and Eric Green is the director of the Human Genome Institute. We have recently described some methodologies for how we're planning to deal with some of these things. And you can read that. And I just want to say that this is another disruptive force. That's the point, the sustainability of the system. Another disruptive aspect is reproducibility, which has come to the fore quite recently in a number of different forms. And I won't go into a lot of this. Some of this I'm sure aware of. But, you know, reproducibility is taken pretty seriously at NIH. You know, it doesn't, and it really speaks to another aspect I was talking at lunch about the fragility of the system. So you can only imagine when a congressman or congresswoman opens the newspaper and the Washington Post and reads that X percent, whatever it was, 60, 70% of seminal papers in cancer research cannot be reproduced. And they say, wait a minute, I'm just going to the appropriations to give the NIH $32 billion for work next year, and they can't reproduce 70% of what they're doing. It doesn't go down well. So, I think and a lot of that perception is misconstrued, but at the same time, this speaks to things that need to be addressed. And obviously, data and how we manage data and how we make data available to enable reproducing, as well as the analytics that go with it, and the statistical analysis and all the other parts of it, are key to all of this. So this is potentially another disruption that needs to be dealt with. And then there's the things that happen. I mean, this slide is now a few months old. We now have another new disruption. And the newest disruption, of course, is the cancer moonshot. So suddenly, when things happen in government, there's an immediate trickle-down effect. That there's this response to it to try and make the most of this opportunity. So a little over a year ago, we had the Precision Medicine Initiative, which I'll say a bit more about in a second. And now, of course, we have the cancer moonshot. And I was absolutely blown away to watch the video from Davos from a couple of weeks ago, where Joe Biden was sitting next to my boss, Francis Collins, along with other distinguished scientists, including Jennifer Doudna, who's responsible for CRISPR and so on, or partly responsible for CRISPR. And having this leadership speaking about the need for standards and data sharing. I thought, hallelujah, this is so, I was totally overwhelmed by it all, because this is something that some of us have been talking about for a long time, and it's really hitting the mainstream. So I think that's all evidence of further types of change. The Precision Medicine Initiative specifically, there's two parts to it. This year there's a $215 million funding for that. About 60 million or so is going into National Cancer Institute to actually speed up the sort of genomic cancer types of efforts around the human genome, the cancer, the TCGA, and other sort of genomic-driven cancer initiatives. And then the other part of it, which has about $140 million, is this idea of establishing a cohort of 1 million people where that information will be shared as I think some of you probably heard from Josie Briggs, who apparently came to talk about this, where that information will be shared for research purposes. And that includes everything from genotyping to electronic health records to mHealth data and so on. I could say a lot more about that and the likelihood of where that's going to go, but I'll let that go. But the point is, it's potentially another disruptor in what we're doing. I probably should go step. So what are so if you take those, whether you believe them or not, I think it does have some implications for the future, which you could also take or leave. So I think that there's the notion that open collaborative science has become of increasing importance, both nationally and internationally. I'll say a little more about that in a different context. But some of these problems are so complex that they're not going to necessarily be dealt with by single or one or two investigators in small labs, that they need collective efforts, perhaps by those people, but towards the collective good. So that all speaks to more sharing of various aspects of the research life cycle. So I think I've already said that out of all of this, I think there's this notion that the analytics and the data are becoming more valuable to scholarship, and we're certainly trying to push on that. And I'll just give you one example, because I'm not going to say any more about it, but we're in the process of organizing a workshop with NSF to go out to leaders, vice chancellors for research, and vice presidents for research, and so on, and those chairing tenure committees, to really say to them, I think you really have to look at scholarship in a different way. That it's not just about science and nature and cell papers, it's about what the overall contribution is that people make. We need better metrics for measuring that. They're starting to emerge, but we need to do more work there. But I think it's just the notion of at least to begin to think a little differently about what's valuable. And then I think there's no question that there's potential opportunities here through data science and other activities to improve the efficiency of what we do. It's rather unfortunate that we fund things on these short cycles where something may just be getting going and it doesn't get refunded and it dies on the vine. I think there's a lot of good research and then the associated data analytics and other things associated with it, sorry, repeating myself, that get lost when the grant runs out. We need better ways of preserving some of that so it can be reused, even a lot of the negative data. So, that we need to preserve more of the research life cycle. We need global cooperation because what we do right now doesn't actually scale very well, and it doesn't actually make a lot of sense in many ways. So a given organization in a given country will fund a database or a data resource that's used by people worldwide. Now, there's sort of a quid pro quo here, but it really is not that equitable. So we ought to have a more equitable way of funding these things for the global community. And that's, it's easy to say and it's hard to do because funders, there's a whole series of issues about funders. Just one example of that, as a bit of an aside, not even a joint funding initiative for some kind of resource, but just to have an open science prize, which is what we're doing right now, is a joint funding effort with the Wellcome Trust in the UK, the NIH, and the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And the idea of that is to take open data, open analytics, and to use them in a new way, or propose to use them in a new way that's going to advance biomedical research and healthcare. And there'll be awards for that. The teams have to be multinational. So that's easy to say, right? I've just told you the whole essence of that idea. But it took a whole year and a bunch of MOUs to get that sort of thing in place. So these things are not trivial to work through the bureaucracy, but it can be done. And once you've done it once, it's easy to ramp it up and do it in many ways. Sorry, I'm talking about bureaucracy, but that's where I spend most of my time these days. So I think that will bring forward, that says a lot. It says that funding agencies are working together to address some of these problems, and we're actually promoting the value of open data and open analytics. So it will be interesting. This is running right now. It'll be interesting to see what comes of it. Then training, and Michelle Dunn, who's here from our group, could tell you a lot about training. I'll say a little more about it at the end. But it's clear, it's absolutely clear there's a massive shortfall between supply and demand. The number of people who are needed and the number of people who are available. We just had a workshop before I left UCSD on big data, and there was essentially just in the San Diego area, there was like 100,000 jobs that had some element of data science in them that could not be filled. At that time, we didn't even have a data science master's program or anything approaching that at UCSD. So it tells you that the needs far outpace the supply. I think we're doing what we can to help change that. We spend about 20% of our budget on training. And then, of course, there are other aspects, which I won't touch on too much today, but that also have to be taken into account, particularly when, of course, as more and more of us spend more and more time using human subjects data, the issues of security versus access to that data become, and when you start merging things together, some very strange, there are lots of possibilities that the provider would not be pleased with that have to be dealt with. You can go on and on. So how are we sort of trying to address these challenges, but also in some ways these opportunities? So we have a project called the Big Data to Knowledge Initiative, which is the sort of main tool for dealing with this. It's a trans NIH initiative. So it's actually run out of my office, but we have council members from nearly all of the 27 institutes and centers at NIH. They form a multi-council working group that actually oversee this whole program. We had our first all-hands meeting last November, and it was a very, very vibrant meeting. Of course, I'm very biased in what I'm saying, but because I want this to succeed desperately. but I think it was actually there was a sense that something special is going on. And I won't quote, because a bunch of these people are actually PIs who get funded by it, so they're going to say whatever I ask them to say. But there are other people here who had no vested interest. For example, Janet Thornton, who was the former head of the European Biotechnology Institute in Europe, came to the meeting just to see what was going on. And she was really enamored by what's going on. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples from early stage work that was presented there to sort of try and illustrate, at least from my own point of view, that something quite interesting is happening here that is, to some degree, different than what's happened before. So just to say, we have a budget for this through the end of the decade, and it's a little over $100 million a year, and we're pushing forward with a whole set of initiatives, and those initiatives change with each funding cycle. We funded a group of centers. Yes, and I can see you throwing your hands out there that it's not equitable across the US. What can I say? It's not equitable across the US. We are, in many ways, we also have diversity programs and a whole set of other initiatives to try and address this, but that's the way it is right now. And you know, there's 12, it depends how you count, 12 or 13 centers, and each of those has joint membership from a number of other institutions, so it's quite a network, even if it is not spread equally all over the country. So we're responding to this by trying to support the community and policies that also push these kinds of initiatives forward, and then infrastructure that really helps it as well. I'm going to give you a little example from each of all of these things that sort of illustrate that. So let me start with just the work of one of the centers. I'm going to show you three just very brief clips from three centers that are working on this. I should also say, outside of the centers, we're funding a lot of R01s, apart from the training and things like that, that relate to things that, for example, relate to particular aspects of software, that relate to provenance, you know, wrangling of data, and other forms of analytics, visualization. And now we moved on to, you know, really modeling and other aspects of data. This is an example from the Craven Center that really sort of illustrates a whole series of projects that are going across that relate to different types of phenotyping, you know, maybe neuroimage based, maybe EHR based, epigenomics, and you know, and breast cancer screening and so on. And then there are various labs that intersect with these different aspects of phenotyping to do stochastic modeling and so on. And just one example of that is this idea that they've already got some, I think, some pretty intriguing results on, which relate to what's been done in the past, of course, is so-called retrospective phenotyping. So you have subjects that exhibit a phenotype of interest. What they're now looking at is prospective phenotyping, where you actually, in this particular example, they took 1.5 million subjects. They took all ICD-9 codes in the EHR, reported for those subjects, and then they took a whole series of cases where they had controls and they had and the ones they were actually analyzing, and they tried to look to see how much they could predict an outcome through a machine learning technique by looking at outcomes that had actually happened, and then taking records and seeing if they could predict those outcomes, and then going back to look to see if those outcomes actually happen. And as most of you in this audience probably know better than I do, but if you look at the area under this curve, there's some statistical significance here, apparently, where in a 1 month prediction, they can do pretty well in terms of predicting what the phenotypic outcome is going to be. This is very preliminary and beginning work, but I think it starts to show what you can potentially do with these large masses of data, in this case, electronic health records. Another initiative that we're funding that just illustrates some of this is around mobility, and this comes from Scott Delp's center in Stanford, where they've taken data from an app called Azumio, And this is just the sort of distribution of people that they were actually looking at. So they had 2 million subjects, and they had a total of captured 74 million days of activity, which gave them over 100 billion data points, which is 1,000 times more than any other study that ever been done. And Haynes was a study done by the CDC. And on the right, all that shows is that there's a distribution that, in terms of age and in terms of what amounts to, at least in the US, and I'm not sure that's US data, but shows where essentially that 28% or so of the population is obese, which is certainly true in the US. But this data is actually global, so I'm not quite sure if that's representative of the world or just the US. But anyway, it's in some way representative data. And then they've just started analyzing it in various ways. So one thing that came out of this is that if you look at the BMI and you look at the number of steps that people take, as you would undoubtedly gather, that there's a correlation between that. Perhaps and this is not a new finding, but it's that in fact, there's quite a differential around gender in terms of BMI versus the number of steps that people take. And this is actually, it turns out, I didn't know this, but it turns out to be relatively well known. But that's just, that's something that's known. What came that was somewhat surprising out of this is that is the bouts of exercise that people take. That what they observed that the BMI drops pretty significantly when you actually have even one bout of relatively small amount of time of exercise per day, and subsequent bouts don't change that very much. I have no idea what the validity of this data is. I think what I'm trying to illustrate here is that there's potentially interesting findings and potentially a lot of interesting analytics that needs to be done on this kind of data to come to formulate real conclusions from it. And so, I just put this up as some sort of tantalizing, at least for me, tantalizing examples. And then just to continue on that on a planetary scale, so the data I just showed was for the US. What we have here is we have a Gini coefficient, which is essentially a measure of inequality between, in this case, it's where you have a lot of difference between obesity of people within a given country. And you can see that countries sort of follow certain patterns. And so it's interesting that there might be a significant inequality in Vietnam, and yet the obesity level is still relatively small. So that would imply that some different things are going on. Again, I think something that just needs to be explored further. And then the last one is, I think, just intriguing because it's a sense of a measure of obesity mapped to data that's taken from Yelp and reporting effectively on the fraction of fast food restaurants within a given radius in a given city. So it's really about the concentration of fast food restaurants and how that in a given city maps to obesity. And clearly there's some level of correlation there. So, you could start asking yourself, well, how do you have, if this is true, and again, very preliminary, but the idea that you're putting together this mobility data along with data from Yelp, and you're coming up with these kinds of conclusions, or at least potential conclusions, I think is intriguing. And then the question is, can you use that in some way to actually do controlled experiments for intervention? Could you get the mayor of a city to say, okay, let's reduce the number of fast food restaurants in this particular area, and let's measure this data from people over a significant period of time. We can do that to some degree automatically. It's getting uploaded through various devices already. And do we make a difference? Can we make interventions and affect people's lifestyles just by doing things that are not necessarily that apparent to them? I don't know, but I think it's intriguing. And then lastly, another example is just from, which really sort of brings to the fore, I think, the complexity of these problems, but I think also points to why these challenges are worth pursuing. So there's a center that's led by folks in Memphis, Tennessee. It's called the Mobile Sensor Data to Knowledge Initiative. And they do a number of things, including developing sensors. They also use existing sensors. They measure various types of exposures. They look at behaviors, and they try and predict or actually lead to, at least this is the intent, to impact outcomes. And they're focusing on two aspects: chronic heart failure and smoking cessation. And I'll just say a little about the smoking cessation one, just to sort of illustrate where I think there's a lot of analytical work to be done and a lot of real intrigue in all of this. So the sort of modeling challenges, I just like this thing on the right, just the different ways people hold cigarettes. It's quite, I mean, I think you could, there's a whole lot of other studies that if you looked at how a person held a cigarette, you could learn so much about their personality. I just made that up. Okay, so, but you know, the fact is that when what you're trying to do here is detect when someone drops off the wagon, when they start smoking. So how do you detect whether they suddenly start smoking, and how does that correlate with other factors related to stress, for example? So first of all, knowing when they fall off the wagon is, even if they're wearing a device, how do you determine what I'm just doing right now versus, you know, taking a puff of a cigarette, particularly when I could be holding it in one of those intriguing ways on the right. You know, these are not trivial sort of things to actually unravel. But, you know, I think there's, you know, as it says, there's various co-founders: eating, drinking, yawning. But, you know, and also the number of instances is relatively small against a lot of noise in the data when I'm waving my hands like this. But, you know, already they seem to be able to detect first lapses based on this kind of data. And now they're looking at that in the context of what caused those lapses by measuring other things like stress that can be measured in various ways, including sensor data that's embedded in glasses that looks at how your pupils dilate and such, which is indicative in some way of stress. So you start putting these things together. Again, really leading edge, long way to go kinds of activities, but already at least producing some interesting data that requires, you know, a lot of analytics and to actually make real sense of it. So that's, but I think if we're going to support all of these things at the NIH and continue to see these kind of things develop, we need to also support infrastructure so they don't die out and so that they can be reused. And we've actually put in place, and we're developing something, and this is not a new concept, others are doing it as well, but the notion of a commons. So the basic idea here is we fund a whole series of centers, and we're also funding, we're operating off what we call the FAIR principles, which is the ability to find, access, interoperate, and reuse data or analytics, because it's not straightforward right now. So we're funding this DDICC, which is a way of finding data. We're doing the same for software. We're actually putting in place mechanisms to locate and use standards. And the whole idea is to put this into a framework which we're calling the commons. And so the idea is that you can go out there, you can look up and find a particular data set that's useful for a task, for example, which you may not be able to find otherwise. Ultimately, we want to see that, of course, cited in a way that it forms part of the citation network. But until it does, we want to be able to find it in that way. We want to see how much it's used, and we want to see what people have to say about that. And so that's the idea of putting that kind of thing in this environment. And we can also measure in this environment, because we actually know where it is and we know how it's being used, we can actually see whether we ought to do something for the NIH, which would be really radical. Should we continue to support this data after the grant has run out? Because right now, it probably atrophies away over a period of time. It was on the graduate student's laptop, and now it's gone. So this kind of thing. And of course, we're, over time, are introducing other labs into this. And I'm running a bit short on time, so I won't go into the sort of architecture of this. But I will just say one aspect of this, which I think is sort of indicative of how we're trying to change things. And that is the model we're using to operate this. So we're actually doing something that NIH has never done before. We're using what's called a credit model. And so what we're going to do, so think about what happens now. You write a grant, you put a line item in there, oh, I'm going to buy a couple of servers, I'm going to need this software, I'm going to need a bit of this person, oh, let me put in $100,000 for that. Right? We give you the grant, we have no idea what you do with that money, and we have no idea whether it's used effectively. Right? So what we might do, and also to drive content into this commons environment, we're not going to give you money anymore. Sorry, that's an overstatement. We're going to make a small experiment where with a small number of people, we try giving them credit instead of to spend wherever they want in a commons compliant resource. We also already have the major cloud providers signed up to this. And guess what? We're not going to give you $100,000 of real money. We're going to give you $125,000 of credit to get you to try this out. And then we're only paying for what you use. Right now, we pay whether you use it or not. So this is just one idea of how we might do some things more efficiently. And we will evaluate, we're doing this in a small, agile experiment, and we'll see whether it works. If it works, we'll think about how to expand it or not. So this is the kind of thing we're trying to be agile about. I'm actually running a bit short of time, and if there's any questions, I much prefer to have those. But I just want to say that we're also working with communities. One community is the Global Alliance for Genomic Health, where we're actually running with them and funding with them some experiments to determine how much people are willing to share and to what lengths they'll go to share and what are the benefits for them in doing so. And this Beacon project is an example of that, and I won't go into the details of that. And I described the credits model. And then the last thing I'll say is just about training. We have different kinds of training initiatives, including, I won't go into the details of that, but except to say that we're not only training people throughout their graduate careers and beyond, but also people who are already trained in one discipline who want to at least embrace and learn more about data science. And we're also experimenting with different things around software carpentry and other types of initiatives. And then, of course, the training materials itself, which is sort of encompassed in what we do through the R25 program, and your own efforts are just one example of that, which we're very pleased to see. And obviously, these things become very important to training the next generation. So that was sort of a brushstroke of what we're trying to do. And hopefully it has some relevance to you. And thank you for listening. And I should also say, of course, this is a great team effort, which actually spans our own little office, but also folks who contribute to this across all of the 27 ICs, institutes and centers of NIH. And including in that is our own Michelle Dunn, who's sitting here and who's been an enormous help in the training activities and beyond. So thanks very much.
So we do indeed have some time for questions. We are being webcast, and so if you have a question, we would like it if you could go out to one of the microphones that are on either side of the auditorium. So feel free to make your way to a microphone if you have a question. Maybe in the meantime, I'll just start out with one, which is that you showed these great initiatives that are beginning to come out of the centers, which look like wonderful descriptive analyses and data discovery. But then a next step may be to find mechanistic relationships. So with the fast food example, it could be that the fast food is driving obesity, or maybe fast food stores are smart and they're just landing where obese people already are. Or it could be a third factor. So what are your thoughts on where that sort of science will sit? Will it then come further out of BD2K, or do you see some other mechanism for it?
Well, yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's really a function of how what we're already doing is perceived at the NIH. And I have to say that I think that there's a sort of wait and see to some of this. So I think if there is compelling reasons to explore these things further, I think that there will be other institutes will pick them up, and they're doing some of their own things as well. I think the issue is that within our own program, it sort of sounds, if you're a PI, $110 million a year sounds like a lot of money. But that's not a lot when you're distributing it across a whole country and you're trying to do many different types of things. But I think that sort of further type of analysis, obviously this is an iterative procedure, and I think I think a lot of this is sort of still very much in the data aspects of things, and we're really trying to move towards the knowledge aspects. But to do that, we really got to take into account these kinds of questions. So undoubtedly there will be more funding for this kind of, the kinds of things you're describing. But where that's going to come from remains to be seen.
Hide behind a pole here.
If I don't like the question, I'm just going to go and hide behind the pole.
Okay. Well, with data sharing being such an important part to this future, we've heard for quite a while about the OSTP memo and some hints that NIH, among the other funders, may be coming out with their policies on what the next steps will be in data sharing policy, data management plans. Have you heard any more details about what the timing of that might be? I know, and I think NIH is holding back and trying to get it right, I've heard before, but maybe...
Right, I mean, we're clearly intimately involved in that, and I have to say that, I'm involved in the governance structure for data science and how NIH at large deals with this. And of course, it has to do with, certainly policies are part of that, and we of course have policy we have a whole Office of Science Policy, which deals with these issues. But then it's what we understand as data scientists, and then of course there's how these actually get implemented. But to be more specific about your question, so for those of you who don't know, the Office of Science and Technology Policy of the US government put forward a so-called Holdren memo, which speaks to the fact that data that's actually generated with public money needs to be shared and managed. That's the good news to some of us. The bad news is that it's in government parlance, it's an unfunded mandate. So somehow we're supposed to do all of this without actually any additional funding, which of course presents challenges. Where it stands right now is that we were required as a federal agency, as were the other funding agencies, to respond to that memo in terms of what we were going to do. It turns out, of course, that NIH is particularly fortunate, I think, in doing a lot of that already. I mean, the National Library of Medicine has been an absolute exemplar for making data available, and will continue to do so. But there are other activities. So, first of all, just to give you a flavor of some of the things that are coming down the pipe, I won't say when, but right now we have a policy that data management plans must be provided on grants of over 500K direct per year, which to me, as I said earlier this morning, is sort of ridiculous, because it basically says if you have a small grant, you're not producing any data worth saving, which doesn't make any sense at all. So we will be implementing in a certain time frame, which I'm not sure exactly yet. I've got ideas, but I don't want to say them, that will be required on all grants. But the other aspect of it is, what's the point of having that kind of plan if, in fact, you don't have a way to see that people are following the plan and it's of value to the community? Why are you going to do all this if these things don't happen? So we need to take care of that as well. So one of the ways, because right now you can't put all of that burden on some poor program officer who has to review those grants periodically to see whether there's compliance. It just doesn't scale. So what we need to do is to move towards a more automated scheme. So that sort of thing is going into place, where the idea would be is you write this plan, and first of all, that plan is then formally reviewed as part of your application. So if you don't have a credible plan, it's going to affect your score. But assuming the plan is credible, then you say you're going to do such and such with this data on such and such a date. So if you're putting this into a repository, then we should be able to automatically extract. It's ironic that right now we don't have any machine readability of data sharing plans, but we would read from that plan when you were going to put the data, where you said you were going to put it. We'd look at where, when, and what. And then at the other end, which we don't have in place at all right now, is that when you deposit data in a repository, the grant number associated with that data should also be recorded. So we could actually automatically go out and see, in fact, if the loop is closed, that you did what you said you were going to do with that data when you said you were going to do it. And of course, there'd be a million reasons for not doing that. But at least we would have a measure of that, and we could actually ask questions. So it's really, in some ways, that sounds a bit heavy-handed. I actually am working on more subtle approaches where I'm trying to get NIH to, and I think this will happen over time, is to really support the notion of data citation. So that in the way that you cite a paper now, you will also be able to cite a data set. And so that data set then could be included in grants. And we would endorse that as being a legitimate form of scholarship to report in grant applications, in reports, and so on. At the same time, it will become part of the citation network that currently is predominantly papers. But when data sets get built into that network, not only can we measure how many citations those data sets get effectively, but it also creates a much richer network where you can go from a data set to all the papers that have actually used that data set, which could be valuable because it would tell you whether you want to use that data set. Or alternatively, you go to a paper, there's reference to a data set, but where is it? And this would potentially lead you to that. So I think that to me is, plus it says, okay, whoa, NIH is actually valuing data as part of scholarship because they want us to cite it. To me, that's pretty profound. But hey, it's all I do now, so.
So I have a question that ties into what you were talking about valuing a scholarship in data science. So if you're just released a software and it hasn't been around too long in the community, it doesn't have the citations, right? So how do you recommend someone to publicize that in their CV? Like you can mention, for example, number of downloads, but it would be great, for example, if software developers had access to say like, oh, how many grant applications are mentioned in my software, right? That could like potentially lead down the line to citations or things like that. Right?
Well, I mean, it's a big data problem to fully appreciate the value of a given entity. I mean, I was saying this in the smaller group, whether it be software or data, whatever, is that it's a big data problem to actually figure out what its net worth, what its value is. So because it comes in different forms. If I have a data set, I mean, I can go to data sets that I've produced, and I've discovered their reference, for example, in patents. I can go to the patent database, and I can find, because it happens to be in a database that has a unique identifier, which is not necessarily a citation, by the way, but that I could at least find it in some cases. And I can find it in the patent database. And so, well, that's good. It means somehow this data was part of this patent application. But that doesn't really tell me still what value that has in terms of its value to innovation. Because that patent could just be sitting there. It could be licensed. It could have actually led to a product that's important or not. So we can't yet put all the pieces together. That's just one example. But I think over time we are beginning to build. There are resources like what used to be called Total Impact, where we're starting, because so much of the fruits of our scholarly labors is somewhere accessible online in digital form. We can begin to gather the things that we do and measure how important they are in ways that we couldn't do before. So, these kind of tools go into Figshare, into SlideShare and things like that, and they look at, what you've produced, what presentations you've made, how many times they've been downloaded. Those things have some value to scholarship, including, what you do in social media networks, the blogs you write, how often there are people who, it's clear in an informal way, people there's a respect level for some people related to blogs already. But that's not counted as part of the formal value. But being really active and appreciated in the blogosphere is probably not going to get you tenure at this point. But I think these are all about cultural changes, but they're starting to happen. In terms of how you sort of bootstrap your way up in this system, I mean, I think the first thing is you need to get You know, you need to get if it's software, it needs to be out there. It needs to have appropriate provenance. It has to, you know, and, you know, I think slowly but surely references to things in GitHub, for example, are gaining some traction as part of being valued as scholarship. But it's a slow process. And we're doing what I just described with data citation, by the way, also applies to software citation. So over time, I think we will begin to see some progress here. But yes, you're at that point of change, I think.
All right, thank you.
Are there any further questions? Well, if not, we will have a reception down in the gallery, and we welcome everyone to join us there. And let's thank Dr. Bourne for a wonderful presentation once again.
A pleasure.